We are continuing our series in the book of Genesis, not going all the way through every chapter and verse in Genesis, but what we're looking at are these encounters with God, these sort of encounters with God of the third kind, these direct moments where God addressed or spoke to the key characters in the story of the book of Genesis. We know that when you read the Bible, God appears and shows up and is at work right throughout, but there are these moments where God addresses people, deals with people very powerfully and directly. And we're looking at those, particularly in the book of Genesis, and we're looking now at a new character that shows up on scene, which is Jacob. And what's interesting is we've been looking at how God has come into this world despite the fact that his creatures, his crown jewels of his creation, as it were, human beings, have rebelled against God, resisted God, turned away from God. These are the early chapters of Genesis. The rest of the book of Genesis shows a God who continually pursues, who goes after his wayward humanity, these people who continually turn their backs to him. And we saw earlier on in the series that God came to a man named Abraham, revealed himself to him, spoke to him, gave him these wonderful promises, and then led him to a land where he promised to bless Abraham and bless his descendants. And we've seen that over the last few chapters. And now we're at Abraham's grandson, one of Abraham's grandsons, Jacob. And it's really interesting to read the story of Jacob. It's really interesting over the last few years as different streaming services have become available, Netflix, HBO Max, and Hulu, and on and on and on. A lot of these streaming platforms have developed different TV series. And a lot of the TV series speak of or talk about or center on families. And usually the common thread is these families are dysfunctional, right? Gone are the times of Leave It to Beaver, right? Or those kind of 1950s TV shows where the families had together, where everyone cared for one another, where the homes were joyful and peaceful. Most TV series now focus on families that are broken, dysfunctional, where people are at each other's throats, where people are hurting each other, where there's division, where there's conflict. And I think some of us have the idea that the Bible is Leave It to Beaver. When we actually approach the pages of the Scripture, they look more like a Netflix streaming series of some sort. In that the Bible reflects people as they really are, not as we might conceive of them ideally to be, but human beings as they really are. And that's what we see in the story of Abraham. Abraham's family and Isaac's family. So Abraham had his son Isaac. We saw a little bit about Isaac last week. And Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau and Jacob, twins, but Esau is considered the firstborn. And the family dynamic is really messed up. We don't have time to get into all of it, but there's backbiting, betrayal, deception, deceit. But what we see is that Jacob, earlier on in the story, as Jacob and Esau become older and become young men, Jacob is able to pressure his brother Esau to giving up his birthright, right? His right to become the patriarch of the family and receive the inheritance from Isaac, from his father Isaac. Jacob is able to get Esau in a moment of weakness. Esau comes in from hunting, and he's weak and he's hungry. And for a bowl of lentils, Esau famously gives up his birthright, his inheritance, to the younger brother, Jacob. And later in the story, through a series of acts of deception, Jacob receives the patriarchal blessing from his father Isaac. The patriarchal blessing that his brother Esau should have received, Jacob receives through a series of, again, deceits and tricks and lies. And that's the background that leads straight into the story. Jacob is the bad guy of the story. He's the villain. He's a con man. He's a liar. He's a cheat. He's looking out for number one. He doesn't care about his brother. He doesn't care about his father. He mistreats them. He's selfish, right? And the story, and all this leads up to the point where Esau, his older brother, is so upset that he says, I'm going to kill you, right? I'm going to kill my brother. And this isn't like when, kids are 5 or 6 or 7 and they're fighting in the living room and one of them says to the other, I'm going to kill you. Like Esau means, I'm going to kill you dead. I'm going to take your life. I'm going to murder you, right? And so Jacob has to flee for his life. He has to run away. He has to leave the land that he's used to, the land of his father, the land of his grandfather, Canaan, and he runs away. And Jacob, I can't emphasize this enough. Jacob is the bad guy in the story. He's the villain. Okay? And what's interesting about the story is God's going to encounter, God's going to meet with, God is going to pursue the bad guy in the story. And the story begins with God's initiative. In verse 10, right, we see that Jacob left Beersheba, this land, this place, and went towards Haran, right? He's running from his brother who has threatened to kill him, right? And you have to understand, Haran had been the place where Abraham had been, and God had called him out of that land, right? So Abraham was in the land of Haran. God had come to Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, and said, Abraham, I want you to leave that place, and I want you to leave your family, and I want you to leave them behind and go to the land that I will show you, because I'm going to multiply you, and I'm going to bless you in that land. Okay? So now we have generations later, Jacob, fleeing for his life, basically in exile, goes back to the land that his grandfather had come from. And so you need to understand that not only is he leaving the land, but symbolically it's like a regression, right? It's like all of God's intentions and purposes to bless Abraham and his family, and through blessing Abraham and his family, bringing blessing, bringing goodness, bringing well-being and happiness to the world. It's like all that is being turned on its head, right? It's being reversed. Jacob is going back to the land that Abraham had gone from to hopefully seek refuge, in the arms of relatives. And so he's running back to this land. He finds a place where he can rest. He lays down. He turns a rock into a pillow. Imagine how he felt the next morning, sleeping with his head up against a rock. And that's where he's at. That's the setup. That's the scenario. Right? This is a soap opera on steroids, and we've got the bad guy who's wrecked his family, and he's because in the whole process he's pitted his parents against each other, his parents against his brother against his parents. I mean, he has just thrown a grenade, launched a grenade into the center of his family, his nuclear family, and he's on the run for his life. And it's just a portrait of human misery, right? It's a portrait of humanity in our current plight. In other words, we are given the opportunity for well-being, for blessing, for flourishing, and we just kind of mess it all up. We just wreck it. And the more educated we become, and the more technology we have, the smarter we become, and the more technology we have to wreck it, to mess things up, to break things, to harm one another. I mean, think about how technology has just advanced exponentially in our lifetime. And it's brought a lot of good. It's brought a lot of good. But no one can question it's brought a lot of bad, too. We can use drones to drop medical supplies to a remote town, or to drop bombs. We can use the internet to access information or to control and manipulate information. Jacob is a picture of all of us. That's what I'm trying to say. An extreme picture, sure, but an example of how we hurt those around us. How we can be selfish and bear the consequences. The strange thing is, you would think from the Bible, especially if you haven't read it or read too much of it, but you have a certain perspective on the Bible, this is the part where God smites someone, right? He's going to zap someone with lightning, destroy him. This is the guy that gets killed, destroyed. But something incredible happens, almost the opposite happens. In verses 12 to 14, Jacob has this incredible experience with God. He has a dream. Somehow he's able to sleep on this rock, so that tells you how tired he is. And God shows up and speaks to the bad guy. And that's when we're reminded that in the Bible, the good guys are not really the people in the story. it's always God. God's the good guy in the Bible story. God's the guy, God's the one, I should say, who's doing good, who's bringing about blessing, who's mending what's broken, right? So God shows up, God speaks to Jacob, and God says, I am the Lord. In most of our English Bibles, Lord is in small caps, right? In all caps, L-O-R-D. And the reason for that, no, you read it L-O-R-D, right? Okay. So L-O-R-D, all caps, that's a translation for Yahweh, or our old Bibles would have had Jehovah, right? This is God's covenant name. This is a name that God does not reveal to everyone. It's a name that God reveals to those with whom he has the intent or intention of having a deep, personal, intimate relationship with, friendship with. Okay? So God has come to bless Abraham, and he wants to bless Abraham's family. He blesses Abraham, then his son Isaac, then the blessing and God's work was meant to go through Esau, but Jacob got involved, messed everything up, blew up his family, is running going into exile, going back to where Abraham came from, and in that situation, God comes and says, I am here to establish a relationship with you. This is crazy. But he shows up and reveals himself to Jacob. And in fact, we know later in the Bible, this is called later in the prophets, that God speaks of this and says, Jacob I loved. God comes to the villain of the story, and he comes with the intention of establishing a committed relationship. That's what covenant is. By revealing himself in intimacy with Jacob, and to love Jacob. And think of what's being communicated to us. Think of the picture that's being communicated to us. This lying cheat. And the amazing thing is God basically repeats, reiterates, reaffirms the promises, the covenant that he had made with Abraham and Isaac. He reiterates it, repeats it to Jacob, and he says, yes, I'm going to continue my purpose to bring blessing to the entire world, and I'm going to use you to bring that about. So he basically says, the land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. He had said to Abraham, the sand. Okay, so same idea. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. I'm going to work through you and your family to revert this brokenness, this messed upness that is in the world. And I'm going to work through you, the most messed up character in the story. Along with all this, God promises Jacob that God, will continue to be with him. He says, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. Now think about it. Jacob has burned all of his bridges with all of his support system, everyone that provides security, right, for him, comfort for him, a roof over his head, everything that is sure for him in life, everything has been taken away from him, or he has wrecked it, basically, right? He's burned all of his bridges. And those who he knows, so for example, the person who he should be closest with, his twin brother, wants to kill him. So think how important it would have been for him to hear God say to him, I will be with you. Even though no one else is with you right now, I will be with you. I've got your back. I will take care of you. You belong to me, I belong to you, I will be with you, and I will take care of you. I want to suggest to you that in a nutshell, right, in a microcosm, in a little summary, in a little glimpse, we are getting in this story just a picture of basically the story of the entire Bible. This is the entire Bible in a nutshell. God comes after people who don't deserve God's goodness and grace and mercy and forgiveness and love. In fact, just the opposite. People have done everything in their power and in their abilities and their intelligence to make everything worse. And then God comes after people like that and says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to use you to bless others. And I'm always going to be with you forever. Even though you deserve none of this, this is what I'm going to do in your life. And that's the story of the Bible. The entire Bible is summarized in, 6 or 7 verses here. And think about the picture, right? The picture is of a ladder, right? There's this picture in this dream of heaven open and a ladder, right? It comes from heaven down to earth, and angels are going up and down, ascending and descending upon it. And the whole point is, Jacob doesn't climb a ladder to get into heaven. Jacob is asleep. He's sleeping on a rock, symbolizing how much he's messed everything up. And God bridges the gap between heaven and earth, and God comes down. And so, if you were an early reader of this story, imagine that you're an Israelite, going through the experience of the Exodus, and Moses comes down fresh, warm from the printer with the latest copy of this book that he's writing about your ancestors, and you read that story. Think about how important it would have been to read, "No, you don't deserve it. No, everything you do, you have the opposite of the Midas touch. Everything you do turns to ash, right? Everything that you try to fix gets worse. But nonetheless, the God that we worship is a God who comes to us, is a God who bridges the gap, is a God who moves to us for reconciliation, for blessing, and more so, seeks to work through your life now to reverse that reverse Midas touch and to use you to bless the lives of other people." This is what the God that you worship, this is what He is like. He is a God who comes down. He is a God who bridges the gap. And so he promises to bless Jacob. So look at Jacob's answer. I only have 2 points today, God's initiative and Jacob's answer. His answer can kind of be summarized as fear, worship, and commitment. Okay, so in verses 16 to 17, we have him waking up, right? And he's afraid, right? He's not left indifferent. He recognizes, man, God is here. And so he responds with fear. Now, it's not fear in the sense of terror that he's going to get zapped. I mean, if he was going to get zapped, he would have been zapped, right? He would have been crushed. He would have been not smitten, smote, whatever the verb form is, right? Destroyed. So it's not that, but what it is this reverence, this is serious. Like the holy God, the great God, the sovereign Lord, this is his house. This is where he is. This is where he connects to the earth. This is serious. This sense of reverence, okay? I mean, I don't care, what is your political position. At any given moment, if we were here talking and the President of the United States walked into the door, it would have an effect in the room, right? It would affect us profoundly and viscerally. Beyond the partisan politics, because of the office and the power and authority that comes with the office. You might not be afraid of going to jail, but you'd still be aware that you don't have a tie, in my case, and feel like you need to, straighten yourself out, make sure you're combed, and it would have an effect on you. Well, this is the idea behind the biblical term of the fear of the Lord. It's God's here, and if God's here, it affects things. It changes the way I behave. It changes the way I talk. It changes the way I stand. It changes things. That's what God does to Jacob. Jacob reacts. Man, God is in this place. This place is awesome, is the term that he uses, right? How awesome is this place? So when was the last time you felt like that in the presence of God? Or when you relate to God, is it like just whatever? We should be aware of how truly awesome it is that we are invited into the presence of God from a relationship. And how awesome he is. And therefore, when we come before God, it should affect us. It should change us. It should impact us. And so Jacob's aware, he's in awe. This is awesome. This is amazing. This is great. I am made very aware how serious this is. And so it leads him to worship. So in verses 18 and 19, in light of all this, Jacob takes the stone, the pillow stone, and he turns the pillow stone into a pillar of stone, a stone pillar. And he calls that place Bethel, or Beth-El, right? Beth, house, El, Elohim, God. So house of God. And Jacob is marking a place. This is the place that I met with God, and I'm still alive. So I'm going to mark this place. I'm going to put up a pillar to remind myself whenever I go past this place, or anyone else goes past this place, this is the place where I encountered God. I'm going to remember this place. And he worships God. And then he makes a commitment. In verses 20 to 22, we read, he says, then he makes a vow. He says, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. Right? Because God had so told him, I'm going to bless you, use you to bless others, I'm going to be with you. You are leaving your father's home and land, but I will preserve you and bring you back. Okay? And so Jacob makes a commitment. If you do all this, then the Lord shall be my God. Okay? Now, some of you may know this. I'm because of my dad, I'm a Spanish citizen. And to acquire citizenship through my dad, there was a whole process, a long process. But it concludes with a moment in which you're brought into a room and you're made to swear allegiance to the king and to the Spanish Constitution. So please don't tell anyone this, but I've never read a single word in the Spanish Constitution. Okay? Larry will edit this out before it goes up online, because that's the one the authorities know. Yeah. I never read a word. I swore by the Spanish Constitution. It's no less binding on me, though. There are implications to that commitment. And that's what Jacob is doing. He is swearing an oath. He's making a vow. He most certainly does not fully understand the implications of the vow that he's making, but it's no less binding upon his life. If you have made a commitment to God, you may not fully understand the full implications that will have in your life, but it is no less binding upon you. Now we may look at this and go, this is a pretty fickle kind of vow. I mean, if God will be with me and keep me, and then the Lord will be my God. This is not much faith. But I want to suggest to you, it is the sapling, the seed, the first fruits, the droplets of early faith. It's shaky, it's weak, it's immature, but it is a change. And God is going to work with that and develop that into greater maturity. I mean, we saw that with his grandfather Abraham. I mean, in Genesis 12, he's a worshiper of other gods. He doesn't even worship Yahweh, or if he does, not exclusively. And yet God comes and calls him to go to the land he would show him, and he does. And then in Genesis 15, God repeats the promise to Abraham, and Abraham says, "What is the sign?" So he's still struggling, he's still not sure, and then God gives him a sign, because God is so gracious. He gives him a sign. He makes this covenant with Abraham. We saw this a few weeks ago. But by Genesis 22, God says, your son, who I promised, who you finally have had, Isaac, I want you to take to Mount Moriah to sacrifice. And Abraham goes, okay, leaving next morning. Off we go. What in those pictures, in that mosaic, in those scenes, what's being told to us? There's a developing and a strengthening and a maturing faith over the life of Abraham. His faith, at the very beginning of his life, is no less authentic, but it's weak, small, it's a little spark. It's developed into a burning fire that believes in God's power to give his son back to him, who believes in God's power to provide a substitute for his son. The same thing is happening with Jacob. It's a weak faith. It's a fickle faith. He has a long way to go, but it's something that's been ignited. As the common popular phrase says, God loves us as we are, but loves us too much to leave us the way we are. This is God with Jacob. He loves him as he is in that moment, where he's at, but loves him too much to leave him the way he's at. When we get to Genesis 32, and this is not even the end of Jacob's life, he will still have more to grow and develop, but by the time we get to Genesis 32, just 4 chapters later, he says, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown your servant." That's very different, isn't it? That's a very different expression of faith. And then even later, when he's an old man about to die, he says, "The God who has redeemed me of all trouble." This is the story of faith that God wants to lead all of us on. You may be very early on in that stage with very, very weak faith. But God is continually going to push and stretch you forward. And that process is difficult. That process is painful. When you look at Jacob's life, it's a life full of trouble. Most of the trouble is trouble of his own cause. In other words, just because God's blessing him and saving him and using him to bless others doesn't mean that he escapes a lot of the consequences of his own sin. But in that process, God is doing a good and great work. And if you step into faith, and if you step into embracing God and walking in commitment with God, God's going to lead you through a process. And it's a good process, but it's a difficult and painful process. Jesus likens it to carrying our own cross and following after him in the New Testament. But it's a process by which he changes us, shapes us, and makes us more like himself. These are the early baby steps of that faith. Now, I'll leave you with one last thing. There still is a question, though, that hasn't been resolved yet in the story, and won't be resolved, really, the entire Old Testament, which is, how can a perfectly good and righteous God, like Yahweh, love a miserable villain like Jacob? How is this possible? How can he not only not destroy him, blow him up, blow him to smithereens for being such a terrible person, if he's a righteous God, right, a just God? How can he do that? I mean, how can he not only not do that, but also bless him and be with him and love him? And how is this even possible? How can he do that to Sam Lago? Right? How can he do that with any of us? And that's not fully answered. I mentioned before, God loves us as we are, but loves us too much to leave us the way we are. But how can he love us the way we are if he is perfectly holy and we are so? And the answer to that comes in the New Testament. When Yahweh becomes a man named Jesus. And at one point in John chapter 1, the Gospel of John chapter 1, Jesus is speaking to a man named Nathanael. And he says something really, really fascinating to Nathanael. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man," i.e. on myself. See, this vision of a ladder is just that. It's a picture. It's a dream. It's a symbol. What does it symbolize? That God will definitively act at a moment in time in history to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. And that looks like God becoming a man. On the one hand, fully man like Jacob, but on the other hand, totally different from Jacob. A man without deceit, without lies, without manipulations. A man who lived in perfect holiness and goodness. Who did all this to revert all the lies, deception, division that Jacob caused, that I caused, that all of us have caused. God would bridge that gap. And what did it look like? It looked like his death instead of Jacob's death. It looked like his death instead of our death on our behalf. God bridged the gap in Jesus Christ. And we know from the story, as we celebrated a few weeks ago on Easter, he was raised back from the dead as the perfectly righteous descendant of Abraham. And what Jesus offers us is his presence with us wherever we go. What Jesus offers us is his continual pursuit of us, no matter what we have done, no matter how many times we've messed up, no matter how much pain or hurt we have brought into this world. He offers us his grace, his forgiveness, his mercy through Jesus. Jesus is the ladder, the stairway that bridges heaven and earth. So the only question I have as we conclude today is, do you know this? Do you know this Jesus? Have you experienced this reconciliation? Do you know what it's like to be able to be in the presence of God and stay and remain alive and have him not only not smite you, but to be your friend, to be with you, to bless you? Because the amazing thing about the gospel is God not only seeks to pursue, is pursuing you to draw you to a relationship with himself and to bless you. God wants to work with you so that you in turn will be a blessing in the lives of others. One of the ways we're trying to work this out as a church, not the only way, but one of the ways is these groups, these missional communities, these cells. Despite how messed up we are, despite how imperfect we are, we believe that Jesus can bless us and work in and through us to bless the lives of other people. But whether you're in a cell group or not, wherever you are, God seeks to do this with you and can do this more and more. The question is, will you step into this? Will you embrace God's calling on your life? As Jesus says at the very end of the gospel, behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Let's pray.